All right, so we are moving right along in Campbell's Oriental mythology through his section now on Egypt. And here's a map of Egypt. Though the waters flow from south to north, Egyptian history more or less begins in Memphis in the south and moves to the north to Thebes, with the experiment of Akhenaten taking place in between them. Although it must be mentioned that a lot of scholars suspect that a huge number of Egyptian culture forms come from the south, from Hierakonpolis. So Hierakonpolis is a very important place. We'll glance at Kush and Nubia, but this is really what Toynbee would call a satellite civilization of Egypt, in the same way that we might say that the Hittites are a satellite civilization of the Mesopotamians. They're an Indo-Aryan culture. They're a very different ethnicity. And here we have a very different ethnicity, a black ethnicity that is completely different from the ethnicity of Egypt, but copies more or less their culture forms. But it'll be worth looking at as we move along here. Now, the first thing that Campbell points out in his section called Mythic Identification is this concept of ritual regicide that took place here in the First Dynasty, which gets going about 3100 BC. If we want to extend it back to the Scorpion King, 3200, when the first hieroglyphs come in, that's fine, except that what does not happen is something known as ritual regicide, or sati, as it's also known in India, which is a myth that unifies the civilization for the first time in the First Dynasty, which lasted from about 3100 to 2850. Thank God it was short-lived. You can't tell much from... This is the first king. You know, the first king may have been Narmer. There's some confusion here. It may have been Narmer, or it may have been Narmer's, as we saw in the Narmer plaque, or it may have been Narmer's son, Horeha. We're not sure exactly who the first ruler of the First Dynasty was, but we are sure that they did this. They practiced sati, which means when they died, they took the entire court with them. And so here's a bird's eye view model, and this takes place at the cemetery of El Kab in Abydos, which is further down, or further, let's say, upriver, the Nile. Here's those three pits that we were looking at. And then it's surrounded by two, which are most likely consorts, queens, and then 30-something retainers. And they were all murdered. They either took poison or they were strangled to death, all at the same time, as King Aha was buried in one of these three pits. In one of the pits, a couple of lions was found with him, or separately from him in one of the pits. And so these would have likely have been three different structures covering each one of these, with a different structure covering all of these retainers. So pretty grisly practice, this, and it seems to have been invented by the Egyptians, 3100 BC, and it lasted all through the First Dynasty, getting ever greater and greater in grandeur, as though each king was trying to outdo the one preceding him in the number of retainers that could go down into the underworld with him. This is the city now of Kerma, down in the south where we were looking at the Nubians. And you'll note, first of all, that the architecture is curvilinear. There's not a right angle to be found anywhere, whereas Egyptian civilization is entirely made up of right angles. This is a curvilinear civilization, so it already has a different symbol to it, the meandering symbol of the curvilinearity. And they are, now this is from the Middle Kingdom, about 1900 BC or so. They have inherited the practice of ritual regicide, and they are still at work at it. So here's the Kerma culture down in the south here, which is a satellite civilization of the Egyptian civilization. And here's one of their death pits. It's round, unlike the Egyptian death pits, which are all rectilinear, rectangles. And these are all retainers that would have been murdered and killed along with the king at the same time. It says subsidiary graves here, but it's really the entire court has gone down into the underworld here with the king. There's a sacrificial corridor, and this would have been the king's official burial chamber. So it echoed, and it was practiced all the way down to 1900, when Sir Leonard Woolley and Sumer unearthed the death pits there. It was about 2350, and it did not originate there. As we have seen, it originated amongst the Egyptians and passed to the Mesopotamians, just as the Mesopotamians passed all kinds of things like mud brick architecture, as we have seen, and the entwining lions with serpent snake heads and so forth. So there was a cross-fertilization there. This is a tomb of Abydos. This might be Queen Merneth, and she may have been the daughter of King Jair, and Nethotep may have actually been the wife of Narmer, and she may have been the wife of Narmer and the mother of Jair. But this is what one of the structures at Abydos may have looked like. And these would be the graves of the retainers that were strangled or poisoned, along with the court, all going down into the underworld. And now in the north, this is what the northern style would have looked like. This may have been the tomb of Queen Nethotep at Nakada. Nakada is a little further east than Saqqara, a little more in the zone of a pseudomorphosis of Mesopotamian culture forms, as you can see from the crenellations, the buttressing and the crenellations here, plus the building of mud brick. The crenellations are definitely a Mesopotamian style, but we don't see any crenellations in the south here. This is more of an authentic Egyptian cultural style, the mound rising up, probably from Hierakonpolis. Okay, so then moving right along here. Here is the big one of all time. This is the tomb of King Den. And something like 378 retainers were murdered and buried along with him in these separate tombs. That is absolutely astonishing. And here he would have been buried in this structure right here. This is the height and apogee in the first dynasty of taking the whole court down with you. Now the question arises, what myth would have informed this? And the myth would have been the astrological myth of certain cycles coming around. It might have been Saturn coming around, most likely Saturn coming around at the 28-year cycle, ending the king's reign. The priests would be studying the stars. They would be watching. 28 years comes about. It's time for everyone to go. They go down into the death pit, and a whole new court comes out. So this is why Joseph Campbell calls this later on, this whole stage and culture period, the way of the celestial lights. It is, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Or, as to put it in the words of Plato, time is in the moving image of eternity. That was the myth now. The myth had shifted from the earth to the heavens, and the primary revelation was the heavens, and were the planets, and the priests studying the will of the planets, laying the basis for astronomy, mathematics, and astrology, and tying it in with this grisly practice of sati, ritual regicide. And here we have, I think this is King Den. And the only reason I mention King Den here is that this is the first time the Egyptians use granite and limestone. So now they're beginning to shed the mud brick pseudomorphosis of the Mesopotamians. This is what the entrance chamber to King Den's tomb would have looked like. They're beginning to shed Mesopotamian pseudomorphoses and finding their own building materials, which from henceforth will be stone, bit by bit, as it comes along, as it's available. And Egypt has plenty of stone, so there's no shortage of it. There's the classical smiting gesture that we saw on the Narmer palette that lasts all the way down through Egyptian civilization. And then, all right, let's see where we at here. Yeah, and so here's a bird's eye overview of the El Kab Cemetery at Abydos. Here's the first of the tombs, King Ahaz's tomb. And here's the tomb of King Jair, the gigantic one. And then the tomb of King Den that we just looked at right here with the first use of stone and the beginnings of the shedding of the mud brick pseudomorphosis. And with stone, of course, you can build larger and larger and larger structures that will last. And here's the tomb of Queen Mernith, who may have been the son, or rather the daughter of Jair. And the northern tombs, now it has to be pointed out that in the first dynasty, each one of these pharaohs had two tombs, one at Abydos and one at Saqqara, with the exception of Netotep at Nakada. Two tombs. And the one in the north, notice, looks much more Mesopotamian. It has a much stronger Mesopotamian pseudomorphosis than the one in the south because it's got crenellation and buttressing. Now the question arises, because these tombs have been looted, so the bodies and the jewelry are long since gone. Which tomb were they most likely buried in? My guess is at Abydos, because Abydos was a much older, more sacred, holier place to Osiris, the bull god. Osiris was associated with the bull, as we'll see in a moment. And this was still a culture associated with the nighttime sky. The constellation of Mesketu, the bull's thigh, was orbiting around the pole star back then, which was Thuban. And as you can see, this is a Mesopotamian, this is from Ur. You can see the similarity of the buttressing and the crenellation. The closer north that a place like Saqqara gets to Mesopotamia, the stronger the zone of radiation of influence, and hence the morphogenetic influence, the pseudomorphosis rather, on Egypt. They had to shed it too. Every culture has to shed the pseudomorphosis of a previous culture to find its own form language and its own form style. And here we have Osiris riding on the back of a bull. I think I have a better image. Osiris here riding on the back of a bull. The bull is the god of the nighttime sky. The crescent horns resemble the crescent horns of the moon. And not only that, one of the nighttime constellations, Mesketu, as we have said, is the bull's thigh that revolves around the pole star. And the thrones of the chairs have bull's legs in the first dynasty, possibly I think in the second dynasty as well. So they're always sitting on the bull. The bull is riding on them. They're riding on the bull. The bull is carrying them to the underworld. This will change with the fourth dynasty to solarization. When the sun cults come in, the Sphinx comes in and is built and faces east. The Sphinx being built 10,000 BC is complete, total, utter nonsense. And that you will see that the throne legs of the chairs will become lion's feet. The lion will carry the pharaoh now, not the bull. And so I think that's where we'll stop for that video. That brings us to the threshold of Campbell's idea of mythic identification.